This is going to be another follow-up video in the series of videos on CSS Animation. This video will show a couple of the other properties that belong to the animation group of properties, right? And I have this is actually not animated here, but this is just I'll refresh it and it'll play once, right? So I have kind of a flower or a lotus or something that kind of blooms, right? And there's a couple interesting features that's going on here. And so let me point these out and then we'll rebuild this animation from scratch, right? So you'll notice the animation plays from beginning to end and it stops on the last frame, okay? The default behavior doesn't do that. So I'm using animation fill mode forwards here, okay? So if I turn that off, what you're going to see is the animation plays forwards, and when it's done, it snaps back to the beginning again. So this is where it started, right? And so that's the default behavior, which is not expected, or at least it fooled me the first couple times I played with this, right? I had to look that up. But animation fill mode determines what happens when the animation is completed. Does it reset, ready to start all over again, or does it stay in the ending state? So fill mode's forwards makes it end or stay at the ending state, okay? What else was interesting in this one here? Well, I guess that was probably the one big point of this, right? But anyway, let's rebuild this animation. So I'm gonna just delete all the code here, and now everything's gone, right? And what I did is I started with a div that was a kind of a parent, right? And so that was the box around the outside. And then I have these 5 divs inside, which are each one of the petals, okay? So I called the parent lotus, right? And then that way I can use that as a, to reference the inner elements too, using my CSS selector. So let's set up the lotus here. So I think what I did was I started with a width of 200 pixels, a height of 200 pixels, and then I gave it a border of 1 pixel solid. And then I don't have to set the color here, but the color will be inherited, so it'll just be the foreground color, okay? You could set the color also. So here I have this, and then maybe we'll give it like a little bit of margin too, so I'll say margin 40 pixels. And so that's pretty good there. Now it's kind of out a little bit from the edge, right? Now what I want to do is I'm going to give this position relative, okay, because I want to position these petals absolutely within this box. So as soon as this one is position relative, if I give the petals position absolute, then they'll reference the upper left corner of their container, okay, or their parent. So let's set up the petals now. So I'll say lotus child div, and that will target all of the children here, right? So let's give these guys a width of 120 pixels, a height of 120 pixels, a border of 1 pixel solid, right? We'll just use the same border there. And then I want to round the 3 corners, but not the first one. So if I save this, I kind of have this, all the boxes are stacked up. Let's move them all. Let's round the 3 corners here. Like this corner will stay pointy, and then these 3 corners here will get rounded. So let's do a border radius of 0 for the first corner, 50% on the other 3 corners. Okay, now let's position them all in the middle. So I'll give the petals all position absolute, and then I'll set the left to, and I'm going to go back and change these numbers a little bit later, because I thought of the other property that was interesting is the transform origin. Okay, so you'll see I'll come back to that at the very end. So if these are 120 and I subtract that from the 200, that leaves me 80. So that means if I set the left to 40, it should be 40 pixels from the left and 40 pixels from the right. It should be like in the middle, right? So I'm going to do the same with the top. And later we're going to come back and we're going to adjust these numbers, right? So now I have all 4 of the petals stacked up in the center. So let's rotate them a little bit, right? And if I rotate them here, if I say, you know, transform, rotate 45 degrees, then they all rotate around the center point here. Okay, so they're all rotating about where I have the cursor, right about in the middle, right? But when I do the animation, I don't want them to rotate around the center. Really what I want to do is I want them to rotate at a spot a little bit lower than the center. So they kind of fan out a little bit more. So I need to set the center of transformation from here. I need to move it down a little bit. Now remember, I've already rotated this 45 degrees. So that means that really I need to move the center of rotation not in the middle here, but I need to put it kind of diagonally. Like normally it's going to be here, but I'm going to move it diagonally down to about here. Okay? To set the origin, right, I'm going to set transform origin, and I'll set the location of the X and the Y. So if this is 120 wide, 60 would put me in the middle. So if I want to go a little further to the left and a little further down, maybe I could use a number like 80 and 80. Maybe let's go even a little further. Let's go like 90 and 90 pixels, right? So that doesn't change anything, but now if I go back and I do the rotation, it's going to rotate about here where the cursor is, right? So now it's not quite in the middle anymore, right? Because it rotated around this point and not around the point in the center. So I need to move it so that center, so this goes right kind of back near the center and maybe a little bit lower down. So what we'll do is we'll say instead of left and top of 40, let's say left of, well, I don't know, let's do, I'm going to just guess. Let's just do like 20. No, not quite enough. Let's do 10. That looks pretty close. I think like 15 actually is about the number. Yeah, that looks pretty good. So now let's do the other number here. So this actually has to come down further. So let's make this about 60 maybe. Okay, so that looks pretty good. We can adjust it later. It still actually looks a little bit off center. My numbers are not very good. Let's see. Let's do 10. I feel like it's going to be like, I don't know, yeah, maybe that's close enough. Anyway, so we can adjust that later, right? Okay, great. So now that we've got this, now what we want to do is we want to set up an animation for each of the 5 petals. But actually, the center one isn't going to move. So the 2 outer ones, these 2 first ones, are going to rotate like counterclockwise, right? And one of them is going to go 45 degrees. Now remember, everybody's starting 45, so the first one here, or actually I guess the second one, is going to rotate to 0, from 45 to 0. And then the other one's going to go from, the first one here is going to go a little further. It's going to point out 90 degrees here. So it's going to go 45 to 0 and then to negative 45. And then the 2 on the other side are going to rotate from 45 to 90. And then the other one's going to go from 45 to 135. Okay? And you could adjust those numbers. So let's set it up here. So let's do, we'll have to do an at keyframe for each of these. So let's call it petal 1, right? And then we'll set up our animation. So we'll do 0%, and we'll do transform, rotate. And our first one's going to rotate from, actually everybody's going to start from 45, right? And so this will be the outermost petal, right? So it's going to go at 100% of its animation. It's going to go from 45 to 0 to negative 45, okay? And then I'll copy this, and the next petal, petal number 2, oops, is going to animate from 45 to just 0. Okay? And then petal number 3 is not going to move. So I'll just keep these, I'll match the numbers here, right? So number 3 isn't going to move, so number 4 is going to rotate from 45 to 90 degrees. And petal number 5 is going to animate from 45 to 90 plus another 45, so it's going to go to 135. Okay, so I've got my 4 animations here, right? Okay, so let's animate all the petals, right? And we'll give them all an animation duration of 3,000 milliseconds and an animation fill mode of forwards. Okay? So they can all share these, right? So they'll do the same length of animation and the same fill mode property, right? But what we need to do now is we need to give each one a different animation name, okay? So let's do that now. So let's do lotus, child div, and then we'll just use the nth child property. So we can say nth child, and this will be the first lotus petal, right? This will be the second one, right? So I'll do nth child number 2. And this will be the third, the fourth, and the fifth, right? So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, okay? So the first one will be animation, animation name, petal 1. And the second one will be petal number 2. It's a good thing we did all the names the same, right? Number 3 doesn't get an animation, so we'll leave that off. This will be number 4 and number 5, okay? So that's looking pretty good. Actually, I wonder if that's doing anything yet. Oh, look, it's kind of working, right? So that looks pretty good. Actually, it looks like it could come up a tiny bit. Maybe I'll just leave it like that. Actually, I kind of like the way this overlaps here, right? So anyway, so that's looking pretty good so far. What else can we do here? Let's do one more thing. Oh yeah, let's talk about this rotate or transform origin right here. So you'll see here that they're all rotating about this point right here, right? So if I look at this guy and I look at this guy, you can see they kind of rotate around this point. Like if I kind of split the difference between this one and the one here, like halfway in between is here, right? Do you kind of get that? So they're rotating around this point like near the bottom, right? So that's actually kind of important. If I don't use the transform origin, right, they're going to be off center now, but you can see now they kind of just rotate like this, which is interesting, but maybe not quite the look that we're looking for, right? So that's what transform origin is doing, right? And then the fill mode forwards is making the animation end on the last frame rather than snapping back to the beginning frame. So if I comment that out and I do this, you can see when it gets to the end, boom, they all snap back to the beginning again. Okay, and then while we're here, why don't we just add a color? So here's like an interesting bonus item. Let's set the background color, right? And imagine like if we wanted to do kind of a rainbow, right? How do we choose the colors so they look kind of like spread across the rainbow, right? If you use the HSLA, it actually becomes like a very easy problem, and you can actually set it up mathematically, right? So I'm going to do HSLA. So this stands for hue, saturation, lightness, and alpha. The first value is the hue, but expressed as a number from 0 to 360. So you can imagine the colors on a color wheel going 360 degrees around the color wheel, okay? And the second number is the saturation. And you put a percentage here, so as 100% is fully saturated, it's all the color, right? The third number is the brightness. And if it's 50%, you're not adding any black or white. So if you go higher than 50%, it's like you're adding white and the colors become pastel. And if you make it lower than 50%, then you're adding black and the colors become a shade, okay? And then the last number is the alpha. So I'm going to just set the alpha to 0.2. 1 is totally opaque. 0.2, or any number less than that, is some percentage transparent. Okay, so let's try this, right? So if I use this for my first color, this will be kind of red, right? The second one, I'm gonna transform it 60 degrees around the color wheel. Okay, so I'll make that 60. And then the third one, I can make it 120 degrees, so I can move around the color wheel another 60 degrees. And then I'll just continue here. Number 4 will be 180 degrees around the color wheel. And number 5 will be 240 degrees, right? So I'll do 240 around the color wheel, right? So now I get kind of a rainbow, right? So we're working our way around the color wheel 60 degrees each time, right? So this is 60, 240. So if we did another one, it would be, 300, right? So I didn't quite divide it. Maybe if I did 72 or whatever, it might have been a little more even. But actually, I like these colors. These work out pretty good. So anyway, thanks for watching. I hope that's an interesting addition to our CSS animation discussion.